Okay, so good to be back. Thanks everybody for having me. It's always fun to talk to any user group, but this one in particular is always well attended and my hometown. I grew up in Vienna, Virginia, so it's nice to be back there virtually, if not in reality, for a little while. Still get up there a lot because my family's up there. So tonight I'd given the kind of the planning group for the user group some topics. And what they said was, hey, of all those, let's talk about this idea of embedding apps and the model-driven apps, Canvas apps. And also let's make sure we talk about pages as well, which is great. So that's actually what I'd kind of wanted to do when I talked about embedding. So it was perfect, fell right into the evil plan. So quickly, when you think about, what is this idea of embedding? Why would we even think about doing this? What we're talking about right now is model-driven apps or Dynamics 365 CE apps, of course, too, and needing to do something with those that maybe the native user experience doesn't support, right? And those, to me, kind of fall into three broad categories. Maybe we need to capture some data from the user that isn't on the form already. It's something that's maybe unique in a situation. We don't necessarily want to add those fields to the form because we don't want to expand the dataverse with all of that when it's something we're rarely capturing, or maybe it's very dynamic and we're capturing it and changing it all the time. Maybe we need to interact with external data. And while you can do that in a Dataverse app, it can be easier potentially to connect to those other sources in a Canvas type of app. Or maybe we've just got a much more complex user experience that we need to build. And the boundaries around a model-driven app sometimes don't make it easy to have the flexibility we need to do that, whether it's the user experience or whether it's some more sophisticated back-end processing we need to do. So kind of that's the big picture of what we're trying to accomplish. Let's look at something a little more specific here. I'm going to kind of talk this through as it plays, and I'll try to remember kind of what's going on. I did this quite a while ago, and I'll kind of build on that story as we get into this as well. So this is a model-driven app. In fact, it's Dynamics 365 customer service, and we're going to look at embedding something into the case form. So here's the situation. I'm on the case form in Dynamics, and I've created a new tab called the Case Triage tab. And on that tab, you can see we've embedded a Canvas app. So it's right here on the tab, embedded directly into the application. And on the first screen of that app, you can see some text, which is personalized with the name of the user and the name of the contact for the case. I've also included some fields in this tab, so you can see how the Canvas app will interact with the parent model-driven app as we make changes to it and we save those changes. Now, if we follow the script through, you can also see how it works. So we're pumping some stuff in there. If a customer says, yes, this is a good time to talk, I can be taken to another screen. I verify information. I make change to information. I click save. The information on the parent application is updated automatically. So it's kind of writing that back into the parent application. We click done. We go back. Customer might say this isn't a good time to talk in another scenario, which I think we're about to look at right now. But say, yeah, let's reschedule this for later. I can also talk to the parent app, even though I'm inside of an embedded Canvas app, and say, hey, open the quick create form up over here, because I want to capture some information that is built into the parent app, and I don't want to build that into my underlying app. Okay, and then I could just close the case. I'm given an opportunity to update some information if I do that. Again, this can update the parent case. So that's just a very high level overview of what an embedded app might look like. Lots and lots and lots of other use cases for that, but I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a visual of what does this mean? Now that's one scenario, by the way. So when you think about this, there are lots of different ways to embed this kind of experience for the user of a model-driven app. The old world, if you've been around these for a while, you know that there used to be dialogues. There used to be task flows. I think those lasted about 10 minutes before they came and then were deprecated quickly. But both of those were essentially ways to pop up some other kind of interface in front of the user, gather some information from them, interact with them a little bit, perhaps update the backend database. Both of those are now deprecated. If they're available at all, they're certainly going away soon, but I'm not even sure if they're even available at all in the latest versions of Dynamics or model-driven apps. So when we think about modern ways to do that, modern experience ways to do that, you can actually do this with business process flows to a very limited extent. We'll talk about that briefly. You can do this with instant cloud flows also to a very limited extent. We'll talk about that briefly. Then we'll spend most of our time talking about the last two. We can embed Canvas. That's what you just saw in the little demo I played for you. Or you can create Canvas pages, which works somewhat similar to embedding, very flexible. So we'll take a look at that as well as we get deeper into the session today. But I thought it'd be nice to kind of unmute or let people put in chat, what are some ways you could see, and I'm going to actually add these to the slide as we do it and give you the slides afterwards if you want to have the list. What are some scenarios? What are some use cases for this that you can see either in your world or just making them up? Is there anything that you've ever run into that you've already done this for, or any other scenarios? And I've put one in here for you already, custom quoting, and I put it in here because this is something we recently did for a client who they actually had a CPQ solution, and we're big believers in CPQ solutions. That's an acronym for configure, price, quote. It's basically a way of saying if you've got a complex process you have to go through to create a quote for a customer, a CPQ solution can embody all the rules for that and make that really, really efficient. Those have their place, but for one particular client, they were using about 5% of a CPQ solution to do what they needed to do, and it would have been much easier for them to just use a Canvas app to make that happen. So we created essentially a Canvas app embedded within Dynamics so that they could automate that quoting process. Any others that you can think of, and you can put them in chat or you can unmute your mic and call them out. And I'm really comfortable with silence. Go ahead, good.
No, I was going to ask if this was specific to Canvas apps or custom pages as well.
Either one, any scenario at all. When might you want to embed any of those four scenarios we saw? Some enhanced functionality that's not natively available in your model-driven app.
So one page, something that we used custom pages for recently that I thought was kind of nice was a landing page for a model-driven app. So they had it was basically an administrative app, model-driven app, but there was 300 things to link to. So it gave so we built a custom page, which was where you landed when you opened the app, and it made it easier to you can click from there and launch off onto the different settings, kind of like the admin panel. So it's kind of a different way to present, almost like bookmarks, I guess, at the beginning of your app.
Nice. Kind of like an internet homepage or something like that, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah,
cool.
I think like same vein is bringing together multiple apps, right? Like if you've got a bunch of apps that kind of belong in the same sort of area or kind of work with the same data, bringing all those together into a single pane of glass and exposing them through a model-driven app is a good use case for that.
Nice. Thank you, Mike.
Yep.
All right. So there's some, you may have more as we go on. I just like to kind of think outside the box before I put you all into the box and start going through specific ideas. By the way, in the slides, I'm just going to go past the ones that look like this, but you can get the slides afterwards. So every section, I'll have some reference materials, and you can go get access to those reference materials. So I can get you the slides afterwards to get all that, but I certainly won't dwell on those pages when they come. All right, so pausing, quick introduction to me, and I think I know almost all of you, but my name is Geoff Ables. I actually live in Charlotte, North Carolina now, but I'm a native to the Washington, D.C., Vienna, Virginia area. I've been running a practice, Dynamics and Microsoft 365 and Power Platform practice for just over 20 years now. In fact, we just celebrated our 21st year. Obviously, it wasn't doing all those things 20 years ago because most of those things didn't exist then, but we've worked our way into that as those have emerged. I'm an MVP. I geek out on the stuff, even though I run a business. I do it largely because it's practically a hobby. I enjoy it so much. So do some blogging, really like speaking. Thank you for having me. And love supporting the community and answering questions when I can. And here's my why. Here's my family. So my wife and I are empty nesters now. Our daughters are both grown, and one lives 6 hours west in Chattanooga. The other lives 6 hours east in Virginia Beach. One has two babies, so we're grandparents now. The oldest is 3 almost, and the youngest is about 2 months. 2-month-old is not there yet. Sorry, I need to get a picture of her in there as well. There's her little now roommate, Verdi the dog. She lives in our home with us and keeps us company in our empty nest. And my wife and I love enjoying fine spirits when we can, and we enjoy riding a motorcycle, traveling, and doing some other fun adventurous stuff together that we can now that we don't have kids that we're accountable to. So love to learn more about everybody else as we get to know them, but that's the human side of me and the business side of me. Okay, so these are the 4 things I said I was going to talk about. Again, first 2 topics are going to kind of slam through pretty quickly. I mostly am doing this because I know we might have people who are in many, many different places. And if I go directly to something like Pages, you may not realize there's a much simpler approach to do certain things. So I like to try to cover all that no matter where you are in the process. So starting with this idea of how can we build this into business process flows? So you may not know, but business process flows are in a model-driven app. There's these things that can go across the top of any given form. And it's called a business process flow because you can basically say, hey, in this case, there are 4 steps in this business process: qualify, develop, propose, and close. And within each of those stages, there are steps, there are tasks, there's data we need to gather. And you can see I'm on the qualify one, and I'm being asked to fill in certain information there. So this is a way that you can incorporate some simple additional user interface work in a model-driven app. If you go, well, giving people a bunch of forms, a bunch of fields on a form may be overwhelming because really at different times in the life cycle of this process, I need to capture different information. And if I just say, here's 50 fields, and I need to train you when to capture each one, or I need to build in a bunch of business rules or even write JavaScript to kind of light those up at the right time, that becomes kind of complicated. With the business process flow, I can say, user, here's a way for you to know wherever you are on the roadmap, you are here right now, here's what we need to know, right? Don't worry about the other stuff on the form. It's there if you want it because it shows up above the form, but you can just focus on this to get your job done right now. Now, strengths and weaknesses with this is it is still a fairly rigid construct, right? Just like model-driven apps, they're amazingly powerful in what they can do and all the functionality, but they're not necessarily known for being super flexible in terms of creating I don't want to say a great user experience, but a flexible user experience. It does just what you want it to do. So if this meets your needs, that's great. It may not. It also, by the way, uses fields from the Dataverse in this. So unlike a Canvas app or something like that, where you can go, I don't need to have these fields present in my Dataverse. It says, I'm only going to allow you to serve up fields to the user that actually live in the Dataverse. And now you've got to change your data model. Even if I only need to gather this field for 1 out of every 50 records in this model, right? So some of the limitations. Link there to learn a little bit more about that. Now, cloud flows are, you probably all already know, of course, about Power Automate and flows. But manual cloud flows are something you can trigger from within your model-driven apps. When you do a manual cloud flow, you go to Power Automate, an instant or manual cloud flow. You can say, I want to get these inputs from the user when they trigger this flow. And you can do this here because it's not a triggered one, right? It's not triggered by a data event or something like that. It's triggered by a user action. So because it's triggered by a user action, it says, well, now you have an opportunity to actually interact with the user when they trigger this action. And I can gather any information I want. That information does not have to live in the Dataverse. In fact, it doesn't have to be in any database at all. But I can map columns into it. So the steps to do this, and I'll give you a quick example on the next slide. You go create your solution, add a new manual cloud flow to your solution. And again, this is a solution having to do with a model-driven app. And then you say, I want to run this flow. You choose a record type to run it from. And then when the user executes that flow, they just go to the flows. It'll appear there as one of the flows they can execute, and it will trigger the flow. So user example, looking at this here, this user was on the A-Datum Corporation account form in a model-driven app. They went over to the flows area. They clicked Mini-Dialog. So I'd created this one called Mini-Dialog. It runs that flow, and you can see in the middle here, when it runs the flow, here are fields that I said within Power Automate that I want to capture from the user. And again, those fields just get fed into the Power Automate after they're captured. You can do whatever you want to do with those fields from there. You might just use them once and throw them away at the end of the Power Automate. You might use them to make some calculations and put some values back into the Dataverse. There is a link here for how to create that exactly. It's 7 minutes, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to play it. But when I get the slides to you afterwards, you can go watch that if you think that might work, that might serve a purpose for me. Let me go check that out. 7-minute video that I created there that will help you do that. I did create that video, by the way, I think in November of 2020. So if everything in there is not totally up to date, forgive me, go in with some flexibility and know that Microsoft might have changed some things since I did it, but most of that's pretty close to the same. Okay, so jumping into the meat, I'm glad we're only 20 minutes in and we're into this, which is good because these next two sections are a little more time consuming. So remember that first app, kind of put a little picture here to remind me to say this, that first little app I walked you through the demo video of, we're going to talk about how to do that at a high level, not in a ton of detail, but hopefully enough so if you want to do it, you'll know how to do it and you'll know some things not to try that the documentation might lead you to believe you should try. So let's take a look at this. So before we get into it, just a quick kind of revisit to this topic. Within Power Apps, there's two primary types of applications. There's really more, as you probably know, but when you're developing a big front-end application in kind of the traditional sense, if we can call it that, you kind of think of either model-driven apps or you think of Canvas apps. Model-driven apps are very strong to me in the sense that they connect to the Dataverse, which is an incredibly robust data source. It has a very structured user interface. It has excellent security model. It has all sorts of features around Outlook integration, SharePoint integration, pre-built data models for customers and activities, dashboards, all sorts of things you can tap into that while you might be able to do a lot of that in a Canvas app if you want to, it would be a lot of work to replicate what's already been done for you in the model-driven world. Canvas apps, on the other hand, can connect to the Dataverse, but they can also connect to like over 200 other data sources. So if all the data you want isn't in the Dataverse, that might be one thing to consider. Or if you're not even using the Dataverse, that might be something to consider. Lots more control, in my opinion, over the user experience, right? You can get down to pixels if you want to get it to look just the way you want to. You can add buttons in the middle of forms. You look at that one app over there on the right-hand side, and that's just one of the templates. But you wouldn't easily be able to create something like that, if at all, in a model-driven app. You might be able to repeat the functionality, but it might wind up as a somewhat clunky experience for the user if you were to try to do that in a model-driven app. So they both have their own place in the world. The constructs around them are kind of different, but bringing them together by embedding them or using pages, you can kind of get the best of both worlds. So when you think about embedding, all right, so remember two things we're going to talk about now. I'm talking about embedding now. In a few slides, I'm going to talk about pages, which is kind of another way of embedding Canvas Power Apps. It's just we're just using a different word, right? But embedding has been around for a little bit longer than pages. In fact, pages is kind of recent. When embedding started, there was a classic method only to do it. You literally had to go into the classic user interface if you wanted to embed a Canvas app. And classic is sort of the user interface that was around up until the new unified interface came out, which was a number of years ago. But you still had to go back to that because that's where Microsoft had built the machinations to do it. There is now a modern method for doing this. Huge caution flag around going to the modern method. And I lived it this last week trying to go back and learn it. So I'm going to talk to you about that as we go into it. For that reason, I'm going to talk to you about both methods for now. You need to do this in the next week or two, or maybe longer. Classic method is where you need to live. So if you want to use a classic method, some of this will be familiar if you're used to the modern interface. Some of this will be going back to classic. You create a solution just like you normally would. And I apologize if you're not used to model-driven apps and solutions. I've kind of assumed some knowledge there so I could get through this topic. But suffice it to say that all of your customizations live in something called a solution. So you create a solution. Into that solution, you would add the table that you want to embed the Canvas Power App into. So if I go back to the video I played for you, that was the case table. So go get that case table and then go open the form I want that embedded into. Open the form, I edit the form. And then what I do in the form is I add a location where the app is going to appear. Remember, I had my app on a custom tab. I forget what it was called, like call script or something like that. So I created a new tab because that's where my Canvas app is going to live. To that area, wherever I put it, it's a tab, it's a section, wherever you're going to put it, you're going to add a required field where you want that app to be inserted. And it has to have a value in it for this to work. So that's why it's a required field. It's also going to be a field that you're ultimately going to hide. So you probably want to do something like, if you're using the account table and the account form, you might say, I'll use the account name. Yes, I already know it's on another page, but it's required, and I'm going to hide it on this page. So it's really not going to make any difference to the user experience, right? So pick a required field you know will be filled in, and not in a place where you expect the user to refill it, because it's not going to show up there. Just add it to the form to start with. Then in the user interface, you switch to the classic view. Okay, so for some of you, you're like, know exactly what he's talking about. I've been working these apps since the Dynamics days. It makes perfect sense. So let's kind of talk a little bit more about this. So once you hit that classic view button, and if you're in the modern model-driven form designer, that classic view button is right in the ribbon bar at the very top. You just click it, you open up this. This is bits and pieces of a classic view. You can see things look a little bit different here. So I would go, you can see step 25. I've done a much more detailed version of this, so I'm dropping you halfway into the process tonight. I would go and say, okay, here's my new tab. And in my tab, I have the section. And in the section, I've added my field. This is the case title field. I can reliably know that it's going to be filled in. Then I'm going to edit the field properties, right? I can double click on the field to pop up this field properties dialog, or I can click edit the properties up top, but I pop up the field properties dialog. First thing I'm going to do, step 26 there, is I'm going to get rid of display the label on the field. And I'm going to also go a little further down and uncheck the visible by default option on that same thing below number 26, right there. Then I'm going to go over to the controls tab. And on the controls tab, I'm going to add a control, and I'm going to choose Canvas app. Okay, so here's where the magic happens. I'm adding my Canvas app to it. Then I go click the add button. And if you pull these slides up while you're doing it, all these things will start to look a little bit more familiar to you. Now, once I pull up the Canvas app, I can highlight it, still in the Controls tab, and notice I've switched this to Web. My understanding from the latest Microsoft documentation is the classic method will not render on phones or tablets. If you want to do that, you probably want to go to use Pages. You may want to do that anyway. So no use turning on phone and tablet. It's really not going to work. I haven't tested that, but I assume that that's accurate. Then I'm going to click Hide the Default Control, get that off the form. And I'm going to click the Customize button from here. So this is where a little bit of magic happens, because if I click Customize here and I go create my application from here, it's going to automatically put that Canvas app into the solution I'm already in, and it's going to add a very vital component to it. If I go create the Canvas app first and then come over here and go, okay, now I want to come back and insert the Canvas app. This process does not always work reliably when you do it that way. So if you've already built it, you can work on it. I'm sure there's workarounds. Microsoft documentation kind of provides some, but this is the easier approach. So come in here before you even start building your Canvas apps. I'm going to add it here, click Customize. It's going to pop up a dialog that will allow you to go directly create your Canvas app from here. So now comes the hard part that we're not going to talk about at all, and that is go build your Canvas app, right? You've got it open now. Do whatever you want to do to build it. Not going to talk at all about that again, assuming you have knowledge of how to build Canvas apps tonight. But if not, there's some awesome learning resources around that as well. When you're building your Canvas app, you will notice this thing that's highlighted in the red box here. It's a custom component, and it's called Model-Driven Form Integration. What that does is it helps to pass in context and pass back context. What does that mean? What that means is you're on your model-driven app. Remember my case form. I'm on my case form. Here's this issue I'm managing for the customer, and it's got things in there like the customer name and the last contact date and things like that in fields. When I pass in context to the Canvas app, it says, hey, this is the record that you were called from. So now I can use information from that record as part of the Canvas app. And taking actions, passing context back, I can manipulate the calling application also by using the model-driven form integration. Remember how I showed you data gets updated in that calling application, and I can even do things like open the quick create form? All of that is driven by this custom component called model-driven form integration. We'll talk about how that works a little bit more. Again, probably better to bring it in first, or probably better to have your application built from here rather than building your application first and then coming here. Now, I said it passes in context, but you've got a little more work to do. So when you go into your Canvas app and you're working on it, you also want to make sure that the context is there, but now you've got to actually receive it. You've got to do a little bit of PowerFX, receive that context and display those records correctly. So you're going to have a form component, probably, right? If you have some data elements from that parent calling application that you want to update, you'll put a form in your Canvas Power App. And in that form, the item property, you're going to want to set that to model-driven form integration.item, just like the screenshot you see here. So remember, that's our custom component. That basically says, I know all about the parent app. You can ask me, and I'll tell you what item you were on in that parent app. Set that, and it'll bring it in. Now, if you follow the process I told you to follow and say, create this application by using that customize button in the old legacy classic version, it will actually automatically set this value for you. So it might already be there for you, but if you didn't do it the way I suggested and you're trying to make it work, you'll need to come back and try to set this manually and hope you get it to work. Now, remember I said you can take actions on the parent record. So here's some different actions you can take. You can navigate to the main form. So while the Canvas app is open, you can go back to the main form, right? You're probably going to lose the context of the Canvas app that you're working on, but it'll take you back to the main form for whatever record you're on. You can navigate to a view. So if you say the user triggers something and I want to bring them back to the list of views and show a specific view, I can do that. Open Quick Create form. You saw that in the demo. I can trigger opening a Quick Create form and it will slide out. So it'll feel like an interactive part of your Canvas app. You can refresh the form, which basically means refresh that parent form. So if the data is updated, it can refresh, and you can save the form. So you can also submit information back to the form and save it. Now, when I had done this last, and I didn't test it before tonight's presentation again, this wasn't working quite right, and I found that submit form worked better. So if you're out there trying to make this work and save form still hasn't been debugged since the last time I actually did this hands-on, try submit form and see if that will work for you as well. And that link is a link really to a Microsoft site that gives you all these embedded actions with a little more information on them. So Microsoft, another link here to Microsoft LearnDocs, a summary. There are some limitations with this. So when this was done, this only worked embedded. When I'd first done this, I was thinking, wow, how do we get that pop-up dialogue feel? With embedded Canvas apps, the answer is you don't. It's inside of a form, and that's the only place you can show it. You can have it be different sizes of real estate and all sorts of things, but it's inside of an existing form. It only works in a unified interface web app, not tablet or phone, or maybe they do one per form now. That might be the update on that. But in the web app, you can have up to 3 per form. So you can have 3 different Canvas apps on one form. I think there may be some conflicting information about tablet and phone. So test that on your own to see if you need this to show up in tablet and phone. Remember the trigger field, that field I told you to put on the form that's going to get hidden. It has to have a value. And by the way, that value has to be text. It only takes text field. So you can't have a date field that's required or something like that. Got to be a text field for that to work. Of course, it's not displayed on new records until that record's been saved because it has no context to receive from that record. And then you can't display it on a parent entity. You can't display fields from a parent entity inside of it using the model-driven form integration. You actually have to use a lookup function within the Dataverse instead to fetch that information. All right, so some of that was a little bit beyond you. Apologies. I think that it's a good place to start. And if you kind of go back and go, okay, I need to do this, let me follow through. As you start getting to some of these slides and you're working on it, it'll start to make more sense to you. Okay, so now let's talk about the modern method. And we're still talking about embedded. We're not talking about this latest thing called pages yet. We'll do that at the very end of today's session. Before I get into that, I want to give you a little story time about my journey with regards to the modern method for embedding Canvas apps. So over 2 years ago, November of 2020, I did a version of this presentation. The first version I did this presentation, I think it was called Replace Your Dialogues Using Embedded Canvas Apps or something like that. Did a lot of time and effort researching it, figured out how to do it. That's where a lot of these preceding slides came from that you've just seen. Some quirky workarounds that weren't well documented were also in there. I can get those old slides to you if you want to look at that older version of this. But when I did that, it said the modern experience is coming soon. So I let people know at the end of that presentation, hey, There's a new way coming. So if you're watching this as a video or you go back and it takes you a few months to get to it, make sure you check out the modern method because it's coming any day now, over 2 years ago. Flash forward to last week. And I'm like, hey, I got to get ready for this session, right? So I'm kind of a last minute guy, but I was like, okay, I'll dust off this older presentation. One of my colleagues actually had done some modifications to it that made it a little faster for me for something he did in October. And I said, this is so cool because I've been wanting to look at the modern method ever since then. And I'm the guy who kind of does business development. So I don't actually get to work in the app that much. I just do lots of demos. So if there's not a demo or a session I'm doing on it, I don't get to learn as much new as everybody else does. So I was excited I could go learn something new. It's like, great. And by the way, I did a search. There was on the Microsoft Docs site or Learn site, I think, documentation on the modern method. Awesome. So started following those documents. A few days later, still beating my head against a wall. I'm doing everything it says. It's got to be me, right? I'm doing something wrong. Another day later, I start asking other people to come. Have you done this? Has anybody had experience? What am I doing wrong? Take a look over my shoulder. Starting to get a little frustrated, using a lot of my time. Finally, over the weekend, I'm like, okay, maybe I'm using an old environment I'm developing. It's create an entirely new environment. See if it works there. Whoops. No love there either. So finally, a day or two ago, I said, I give up after all that time and effort put into it. Either I'm not smart enough to figure out the Microsoft documentation or the modern method doesn't fully work. So that's my story. And now I'm here whining to you about my story. So I'm still going to talk to you about the modern method because it looks like it's right on the doorstep of being complete. And so I want you to know about it, but I also want you to know the shortcomings so that if you go do this a week, a day, a month, a year from now, you can quickly go check it out to say, is this doing the thing Geoff said it's not doing yet? And if it's not, maybe I'll move on. Or maybe I'll find someone smarter than Geoff that's figured out how to do it. So similar start to what we did before. If you're going to do this with the modern method, you go ahead and create a solution. You add a table of that solution. You open the form you want the app to go into. You add a location, tab, whatever you want the application to go into. And then you just go add a component to the form, right? So if you've ever designed a model-driven app, you know how this works. I look over at my components. Under the display components, there's one called Canvas App. And by the way, it was there in 2020 also, but maybe it was just as functional as it still is. You can drag and drop that or click that and bring it over here. When you do that, you're going to get this flyout. And it's a kind of confusing set of terms, although if you look at them closely and you look at my old classic view screenshot, those same fields were in there, but when I clicked the customize button, it filled all those fields in for me. Now it's kind of like, here's these fields, go fill them in how you need to make this work. So I spent some time scratching my head looking at these and looking at the Microsoft documentation. For each of these three things, entity name, app name, and app ID, these descriptions read almost exactly the same. Bind to table column. When bind to table column is selected, static value property changes to a line. You can read all that. I'm not going to go through all of it for you right now. But I read that and read that and read that again. I was like, I'm just be thick. I am not understanding it. Felt like it's just kind of telling me, in long form, what it already says on this form. So I spent some time going back and looking at the other application, but I thought, you know what? Let me ask everybody's new best friend what this means. Hey, ChatGPT, can you explain to me what this means? Copy paste the text from Microsoft, right? Surely ChatGPT is going to know the answer, but I think it had about the same reaction that I did. Okay, I just made that up, but that's what was going on in my head, and ChatGPT didn't help me much. I actually did try pasting it in there, rephrased it, but it didn't tell me much new. So here's my interpretation of what these three big categories mean. First of all, entity name, and app ID. And then I'll get into this bind to table column thing in just a minute. So entity name, I believe, in fact, I'm almost certain, that's where you're going to tell it the name of the entity you want it to bind to, or the context of the entity. So if you're on the case entity, you're going to type cases in there. If you're on the account entity, you're going to type accounts in there. And that basically just says this entity contains the information that you want to pass to your Canvas app. Now, in the classic documentation, what it says is, I populate that value for you, but really it's a placeholder. I've stored this somewhere deep in the database. And even if you change that value, it's not going to change anything for me because I know how to bind this to it on my own. Okay, so is this different here or not? inconclusive. Now, app name is the unique name of the app, right? And if you're not sure, if the unique name of the app, right? It's that system name that it gives it. So it's probably got that prefix and then some longer name for the app that you've developed, the Canvas app that you've developed. There's also app ID, and that I know is the actual, I guess it's a GUID. If you go to your Canvas app and you hit share, you come up with a screen, it gives you an app ID on there. This I'm actually 100% certain is what it is because I put that in there. I publish my form, I go look, and my app is showing up in there. However, it does not have context, so it can't pass any data values into it. So that app ID definitely goes in there. And by the way, that is the only required field on this form. So leads me to believe that maybe that's all you will need in the future once this all works out. So those are the three fields that are a challenge. If you want to embed a Canvas app and you don't need context, you don't need to know the parent record you were called from, you could just fill in the app ID field and work with that. I have a hard time coming up with a use case where I'd want to embed a Canvas app and not need to know the context of the record I was on, but maybe there's a use case like that. Okay, and just really quickly, the app name is, if you're in your solution and you go look at your Canvas app, your app name is going to show up in the name column, pretty intuitive. And if you want to get the app ID, you can go down to details and you can see the app ID there, or if you go to share, you'll see the app ID there as well. So you can go there and you can copy and paste those into those fields if you need to. Now remember, each of those three, I'm only showing you one, but each of those three things has another checkbox for bind to table column. And that's where the text from Microsoft got really confusing with that. But what that means, I'm almost certain, is what if you want to do this dynamically? For example, what if I want to fetch information from a different table, not the one from the form? Like maybe I'm on the case form, but I want to fetch information about the account that the case belongs to. Well, in that case, or maybe depending on the context, it might be different. So maybe there's a field that says, hey, you want to go get information from the account here. Now you want to go get information from the customer here, right? Maybe you're in an organization where sometimes the customer is an account, sometimes the customer is a contact. So you want to get different context depending on what's going on your parent model-driven Power App. That bind to table column lets you say, use this column to pick out what you're going to get context from. You can even do that for use this column to determine which actual Canvas app you're going to run. That would be weird and tricky to the point where I'm not quite sure if anyone would ever use it or even why Microsoft put it in there. But you could essentially say, hey, depending on some value on this model-driven form, I'm going to open a different Canvas app based on the value in that form. Again, probably something you would never use, but if so, probably be very rare. So trying to give you an explanation of those fields because I spent a lot of time scratching my head and pulling hair out trying to get through all of that stuff. So here's the modern problem with this, or the problems with the modern interface, and that is that component, that model-driven form integration component, it never showed up in the Canvas app that I built for that. And remember, model-driven form integration, that custom component, that's how you pass context back and forth between the model-driven app and the Canvas app. Again, maybe there's something I was doing wrong that if I'd done it right, it would have put that into this kind of Canvas app using the modern experience. Tried a lot of permutations, I could never figure it out. Maybe it's not necessary and there's something I was missing to do it. But I did try a lot of different permutations and it never showed up. So my gut is Microsoft hasn't quite finished the process of linking those two things together, and although the documentation is there. So frustrating experience, but what I would say is if you get into this and think, I really want to do an embedded app, that makes sense in my case, go check out Modern first because things are changing every day. Quickly try to put one in there. And if you don't see that model-driven form integration in the list of components in your Canvas app that's embedded, you're probably going to be miserable and you may need to go back to the classic way of doing it. And by the way, please don't feel like I'll be embarrassed if you're like, Geoff, I actually know how to do this. You're doing it wrong. For the good of everybody, jump into chat or during the Q&A period, jump in and talk about it. But I suspect I'm saving everybody a lot of time because I'm pretty sure it's just not really functional yet. Okay, so now let's talk about the fourth one, which is actually a super exciting one to me and might even be replacing embedded Canvas apps. So that might be why Microsoft hasn't fully developed those at this point yet either. So now we're talking about pages. When you look at the user interface, it just says pages, but they're basically pages with the Canvas app inside of the page. And they're more flexible and easier to work with. So a couple of things covering that from just right up front. So according to Microsoft, when they talk about, hey, we've got this new Canvas pages versus embedded apps, they say, quote, in most cases, we recommend custom pages for tighter integration and better performance. I'm summarizing. The layout is a little more flexible with them. I like how you can do pop-ups and slide outs and all sorts of other things. Microsoft says you overcome the number of embedded apps limitation and those kinds of things. So seems pretty cool. And I kind of wonder if maybe Microsoft has said, you know what, pages of the future, and they've taken their resources and started going down the embedded Canvas apps route, and they've repurposed them to build out pages and make them more flexible. And maybe that's going to kind of get deprecated sometime soon. So maybe that's why I ran into something that was documented, but wasn't quite working the way it should. Okay, so when you talk about pages, there's really 4 different user presentation capabilities for pages. You can do a full custom page. You can do a pop-up custom page. You can do a pop over custom page, or like sort of a dialogue, and then you can do more of a slide out page. And there's actually one that's not in here, but you can also create a page and just have it be in your regular navigation. I'll come back and talk about that closer to the end. So instead of having it triggered by something on a form, you can just say, hey, here's a new navigation area, just like you see, well, here's one called landing page. So that could be a page right there. You just click it, that page pops up, just like if you went to any other one of these links over here. So how do you create a page? It's pretty simple to get started with it. So when you're in your solution, you go to New, App, Page, right? So when you go to New and App, you have 3 options. You can create a Canvas app. That's going to create a standalone Canvas app. It's in your solution, but it's a standalone Canvas app. Get a model-driven app. You know what that is. Or you can go create a page. Now, you might think, well, if I want a page, isn't that a Canvas app? Should I just go create a Canvas app and then put that on my page? Doesn't work that way. You need to create it as a page. Somebody mentioned pages have some limitations that you don't have within Canvas apps, and that's true. But this is how you create them, right? You might be able to try to embed it in an iframe or something. I haven't gone that far, but you really want to start with a page and create your Canvas app on that page. So new app and then page. Then you go design your page. Now, when you're designing your page, you still have to receive context for whatever called it. So assuming this page is going to be triggered by a form, and I'll show you one I actually built out, you're going to want to go into the Power Effects, and you'll go into the App component, and you'll go to the OnStart property, and you'll just plug this in. Now you can see there's some placeholders here, so you'll need to plug in the actual entity or table name in here and a few things like that to make that fill up. I'm going to give you at the end of this some real fully fleshed out stuff. So if you're like me and you're like, I hate those placeholders because I'm not quite sure how to fill those in, I'll put some of those in there for you. You'll also need to go to the form. So it embeds a form on the page. That's your edit form, or it's going to have some data probably received from your parent app. You're going to go to the data source property, and you're going to put that as your data source name. And you're going to do the item property, and you're going to call that record item. Record item is what's created up here. So you're going to it's going to say, hey, you got called by this, here's the record. And then when you're on the form, it's going to say, hey, form, here's a record I want you to display. Now, one limitation of pages is by default, they're only one page, right? They're only one screen. So you might want to have multiple screens on your page. There's a lot of other properties here too. I thought this was one of the more helpful ones to talk about. So if you say, I'm used to old Canvas apps, can I call them that yet? Where I have multiple screens. I want to have multiple screens on my page. You can do that. You just go into the settings for that page. You go to display, scroll down, enable multiple screens, and you can start to use multiple screens on the page. Now, full disclosure, full consideration here. Remember, you can call pages from pages. So you might go, well, I'll just have 2 or 3 or 4 pages, and then I'll just call my pages one from the other if I need to. So this too is another option, but you've got that if you need to move around to some different things. Then you need to say, okay, now when I'm going to call my page, I showed you how to put the stuff in the page to receive context, But now you've got to get some code that sends that page context, right? So the page is saying, I'm waiting here for you to call me. When you call me, tell me who called me. Now we have to say, okay, I got to broadcast that. I got to tell this page who's calling me. So the first thing you want to do is go get the logical page name. So again, back in your solution on your page, go to the name column. You're going to get that system name for your page. Then you're going to select the appropriate sample code. Stay tuned. I'll talk about that in just a second. It's JavaScript code. And then you'll edit that code, and you'll put the logical page name in there, entity name in there, and record ID code in there. And you'll probably do a couple of other things. Okay. So if you're like me, you're kind of like hair on your neck is standing up. You're like, JavaScript, I always get into trouble when I do this. I certainly did over the last couple of days as I worked it through. But here's kind of in general how the code works, and we're going to go take this apart together so you'll learn a little bit more about it. So first of all, you created your code. There it is over there. I'll come back and talk to you more about how we created that code, but there's the code. Now in your solution, you'll go to New, you'll go all the way down to More, you go all the way down to Web Resource. You'll load that, right? You'll have saved that code locally. You've opened it with Visual Code or Notepad or something like that. You'll click Choose File. You'll load that code in, you'll save it. Now that's in there, you're able to now call that code. Okay, so before we talk about how do I call that code, let's talk a little bit more about what's in this code that I just showed you. Where did this come from? Where can you go get more examples? And what do each of these things mean? I can tell you that the code samples provided by Microsoft covered a lot of this, but not all of it. And if you're a pro code person or even an advanced low code person, is probably like, no problem, I know what to do with this. That's not me. So I had to go and kind of do a lot of research on this, talk to some of our folks internally to kind of put all of this together. So trying to save you that time if you're like me to give you something you can spring off of quickly. So let's start right at the top. Very first thing is, this is JavaScript. You're going to call it from a form. You need to wrap it inside of a function that you can call. I named my function open-centered dialog. Microsoft's code did not include the function wrapper on this, so probably need to do that if you're calling it the way I envision you doing it. Notice I also put in parentheses there the word execution context. What that means is when the form calls this, it's going to tell me about itself, and I'm going to receive that in a variable called execution context, so I can use it later on in my script. So got to declare the function and got to tell it, hey, you're going to pass information to me when you call me. Next couple of lines, also not in the Microsoft documentation, but what you need to do is get the ID of the record that was on the form that called this, right? So you're on the case form. What's the GUID? What's the ID of that, right? And it's not really on the page, right? You never display the GUID. That's an ugly ID field that the user never needs to see. So these couple of lines basically say, what record am I on? How do I know what record I'm on? Remember the function? It's an execution context. This is where execution context gets used to say, I now know which record is currently selected. The next line says, give me the ID for that record that was selected and format it in a way that I can use later on in this script. And by the way, this is only needed if you're going to pass context. So if you want to pop an app and it doesn't really need to know where it got called from, you don't need this. This is only if you're going to pass it the ID of the field that called it. Next section is where we're going to prepare what we're going to use to call that page. What values are we going to pass along to it? So page type, from all the code examples I've seen from Microsoft, is always called custom, right? Just says custom. The name, that's that name you've copied and pasted. Remember I mentioned that earlier. So this is the name of my page, the system name of my page. I'm going to paste that in there to call it. The next two lines are only needed if I'm going to pass context. So again, you're going to pop the form. You don't really care about what you're on inside of your model-driven app. You don't need these fields, but you're going to pass it the name of the entity that you are on. Here's the entity you're going to get context from. You're going to pass it the ID of the record that you're on for that entity, so it will know which record to open. Again, those two lines only required if you're going to pass context. Now, the next thing is, this next section says, what kind of dialogue am I going to open? And I've given you my example here. These other two ones with a white background, these come directly from the Microsoft site. And in fact, this one is almost exactly like the Microsoft site too. But you can see if you say, I want to open a centered dialogue, well, there's the stuff to do to open the centered dialogue. Full page, I want to take up the whole screen, or a side dialogue. there's the ways to do that. I modified mine a little bit. So it said width was 50, and I said, not everything's fitting in here. So I'm going to make my width 65%. And I put a title in here, create a planner. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. So that's most of the work we have to do. And then we just say, okay, go ahead and open the form now, right? This is the final function call to go ahead and open the form up. And this comes directly out of the Microsoft documentation on this. I see some people sharing links. I'll share some more with you where you can just go and put this in here. Now, Microsoft stuff comes with all of this in one, but a lot of it has placeholders. It's missing the function calls and a couple of first lines. So use a Microsoft resource. That kind of helps walk through this in a little more verbal, spelled out format. Come back to here if you're like me and you're like, wait, what exactly do I need to do to get these things ready? And this will be in there. And by the way, if you want that full code from me, I know this is all going to be in like a PDF format where you can't copy and paste it. Just ping me or email me or LinkedIn me or something. I'll be glad to get you a copy of it. And remember, again, we saw these before, but the code I've shown you here so far is the JavaScript that gets called from the form or the button, however you're going to call this page to open it. These are the Power Effects functions that get loaded into the page, into the Canvas app that sits on the page. And again, these are only necessary if you're passing context. Now, there's some other options for opening the page too. You can embed it into the app navigation, like I said up front. So you can just go create a page, add an app, and put it in there. You can open from a field in a grid or, of course, from a ribbon button. I'm using a on-change event to open what I'm going to show you in a second here. And I did that just because it's easy. I'm not sure if it's a good use case or not. And then you call your code. So go into your form. You're going to add your JavaScript library that you saved to your form. You're going to call the function. You're going to add the app to the solution. That's an easy one to miss. I'm going to come back and harp on that a little bit more. In your solution now, at a minimum, you've got a page, you've got an app, you've got a web resource, and you got a table form. There seems to be a lot of funkiness when you're publishing web resources and pages. A lot of, publish the whole thing, publish this and that. So remember to try publishing a bunch of times if it's not working exactly the way you want. Also, I always, when I'm debugging my JavaScript, I put an alert on it and I change a version number for that. So I know it's executing the latest JavaScript. And when I have a page, I do the same thing there. So if I look at it and go, well, this page doesn't look like it's doing what I just told it to do. Well, if it says V2 and I'm on V3, I know that I haven't published the right version of it. So work on publishing. But here's an easy step to miss. If you have a page that you want in an app, even if it's popping on a form, right? It's not in your app navigation. It's on a case form or wherever. You have to go to the app that form is in, and you have to add it to that app. So make sure you have it. And if you go, well, this is actually in 3 different apps, this form appears, then you have to take all 3 of those apps, bring them into your solution, and add that page to all 3 of those apps, not into the navigation, but add it into the apps. And then you can see you have the JavaScript library here. There's my JavaScript library. I went to the phone number on change event, and I said, okay, from this library, run this, and remember to pass the execution context to make this work. Do I need to, I'm on my last few slides. I'll wrap up super quick. So here it is in production. So this got called from the on-change event to phone number. You can see it passed context. There's my account info from the calling page. There's some other fields. I didn't add any other functionality to it other than this, but I kind of got the, the happy moment of seeing this actually pop up with context, and I could make some edits to it if I wanted to. This was kind of inspired by a client who basically said, we want to be able to trigger creating projects from an account, but we don't need a fancy project management system. We just want to create planner projects and pass it some values and automate some templates. So this is kind of a little bit of a dream for how that would work. There's a lot more you could do with this app, of course. You can trigger Power Automates. You can update your model-driven form from it. From that page that I put in here, you've got all these navigation options for navigating to other pages, other parts of the model-driven app, whatever you want to do. There are some limitations, but there's also a lot of flexibility in it. So you can do a lot of things you couldn't do in your old model-driven apps. Last few links for you, and then we kind of call it a day. I know we're right at the end of time. People are going to start exiting. That's fine. I'll go one more slide. We'll take questions. But I'd really like to ask, and you can share them out loud or in the chat here. I'm going to be doing this presentation several more times this year. I know of a couple already. So I'd love to know how I can improve it. If there's something I could do to get more to the point or the meat of what you want, let me know. All right. Again, if you want the slides, if you want the code, if you want anything like that, ping me. I'm Geoff Ables with C5 Insight. If I can do anything for you, happy to have a conversation with you about it. We have 1.5 minutes for questions, but I'll stick around longer if anyone has any. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate you being here. And if you have to exit, totally understand, but appreciate your time and hope you got some value out of it.